So we are on top of the hour now, but as usual, let's start about 4 minutes to give more time to join.
Marco, can you quickly go to my slide and see whether slide 2 made it in?
Slide 2. Yeah, now they should also be linked in the notes, by the way. Oh, you mean version 2?
Yeah, which differs from version 1 by its slide number 2.
Okay. Yeah, last time I checked, the data tracker said version 1. I think.
Yeah, I was hoping to see whether MeetEcho has that slide, so maybe I should just steal the slides from you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So that's the most important slide, the slide about the confusion.
Oh yeah, it was fine already. If it was the second version, it was number 01, which is what we have.
Yeah, I think MeetEcho is a little bit too hesitant to follow its commands. So each time you pass around something with slides, you have to accept it with this additional frame. That's annoying.
Right.
So Esko, I have some slides on the general issue of query parameters and how these are used and so on, and whether we might want to put something into the curricular. So how do we structure this agenda item?
Yeah, if you have some slides, maybe we could do that first, kind of look at the general case. I don't have any slides.
Yeah, but I don't have slides specific to conditional attributes. I'm just talking about the thing in general. And I think we first have to introduce the conditional attributes question.
Right, yeah.
So maybe you can quickly start and then we can hand over to me.
Yeah, that's also fine. I don't have any slides for that.
You don't need.
But we should recap the question, basically.
Good.
Okay, are we okay to start then? It's 3 past now.
Yeah, and I think all the usual suspects or expected ones are here. Let's get on it. So welcome everyone. This is the interim meeting of the co-working group. I'm Marco, my co-chairs are Karsten and Jaime. And being this an official IETF meeting, then not well applies, plays not very well. It's about IPRs and patents and so on. You have to disclose your knowledge of IPRs if you are aware of any, or refrain to participate in any technical discussion as an alternative. And it's also and especially about our code of conduct, so be nice and professional with one another. And the agenda for today is 2 items. One was raised by Esko, starting from the document core conditional attributes, and then it's a bit broader than that, actually, on handling query parameters in general. And yeah, you heard from Karsten, he also has slides about that. And the second item is an individual submission that we have and has been revived recently, Yang Sit Pen. I think Karsten plans to give an overview about the status, and then we were thinking to consider a working group adoption call for that. Any agenda bashing or more agenda items? Heard none. let's go on with Esko and Karsten. We are taking minutes at the notes linked in the chat. Thanks, Richard, for chiming in. Anyone is very welcome to help.
Okay. So maybe it's useful to share the draft and conditional query parameters for co-op observe, just in case we need to look something up there or have a look at the text.
Yes, I'll try to share my screen. I wasn't ready for that.
Oh, all right. Sorry. Yeah. Could be useful. Yeah. So I think this was kind of a question that came up during sort of a random review that I did, so looking into the document at some point. And that was, I think, when I noticed that in the conditional parameters, there's a bunch of those defined in the draft. And I noticed there is a registry defined also. So that means you can basically define new conditional query parameters and add them to the registry. So you get basically other ways to put a filter on observation results. Yeah, so one example is you do a co-op observe action and you specify a conditional query parameter that says, okay, I only want to get an observation notification if the change in the value is greater than some predefined step, some value step. So that can be used to reduce, for example, the number of notifications. Only get observe notifications if you really need to get those. So it's under control of the client, basically. And yeah, there are a set of these parameters, query parameters defined. Now, I think the problem that could come up is that, well, what if the client decides to use a pretty new conditional query parameter that it knows about and adds it to the query, and then goes to do an observe operation on a server that does not know that type yet because it's new. So it's not defined in this draft, but maybe in a draft next year or an IRC next year. And yeah, the question that could come up is then what should that server do with it? So it's basically getting a query parameter that's unknown. So there are a couple of options how you could go ahead with that. So if it's unknown, you could say, oh, that's an error because that's not allowed in the resource. So the server could give back some error, client error. Another solution would be, for example, to recognize, hey, this is a conditional query parameter, but it's one I don't know about yet. So let's just ignore it. So that means the client gets perhaps more notifications back than he would like to, but the thing still works. So the observe action still works in that case. Yeah, that kind of ties back to the type of model for interoperability that we are looking for with this document and in this working group. So I wasn't too sure about that. So you could have a form of interoperability where both the client and the server both know which of these commands they support because they are, for example, defined by the same specification, which could be a derivative specification like, for example, lightweight M2M or something application level protocol like Matter. So anything that derives from IETF specifications could just specify, okay, yeah, you do support these and these query parameters, and that's it. Yeah, or are we looking for something more general so that it can evolve and basically that the newer clients can also send these parameters to an older server and it will still work? So I think that's kind of the introduction to the issue. So one idea was basically to recognize conditional query parameters by their format. So it's like C dot something. And then we could say, well, we ignore them. in case basically the specific parameter is not implemented or not recognized. So that means a server could implement a subset of those parameters and not necessarily all of them. And there was some discussion on the list also about that. So any ideas about that?
Would this be a good time for me to chime in with my slides?
Yeah, if you want, that would be good.
Yeah.
Have a bit more introduction.
Okay, so what I have here is a perspective on this problem. Of course, my telephone starts to ring now. It's a perspective on this problem from the point of view of the corrections and clarifications draft. So do we have something here which is not properly specified, that is either specified wrong or specified in an unclear way? So we need a clarification here somewhere. Given the number of messages we have had on this subject, this might be the case. So I'm just looking at this issue in an independent way from the specific questions raised by the conditional attributes draft. And as Esko said, so for instance, one thing we could require is ignoring unknown conditional query parameters, which are still called conditional attributes on these slides. So before I go into details, there is some confusion here, and it has in the past already created a lot of confusion. So the draft is called conditional attributes, but this is really about query parameters, as Esko correctly said. So things that turn up in URI query options in a CoAP request. So we really learn about what should be going on from 7.2.5.2. We also have something called attributes, which we typically just use as an abbreviation for the word target attributes. And these are things like RT equals, IF equals, CT equals in core link format. So this is something that, for instance, a server can describe in their well-known core about a resource that it offers and how to get at this. And this thing actually has a registry. So we might want to use this registry for something, but let's look at the details. So conditional attributes is not about target attributes, it's about query parameters that control notifications. And yeah, of course, if we come up with a convention for those parameters, we might want to put them into IF equals, because that's exactly what we use to indicate that certain conventions are being followed. Okay, so that's just that's just background. Now let's look at what we have. So URI query parameters are defined in the CoAP specification. CoAP takes apart the URI query component, which in HTTP is just one long string, and uses the ampersand character as a delimiter and makes 0 more URI query options out of that. And there's nothing special about queries, except there is this one slightly opaque statement: the query serves to further parameterize the resource. I think that's wrong, but it's not that wrong. Yeah, Esko just copied the other statement in the chat, which is more in line of what we usually do. So yeah, generally, I think we can say that CoAP does things here in a way that tries to be compatible with what we do in the big web. Now let's look at the big web, or the web in general, and what standard 66 says is that the query component contains non-hierarchical data along with hierarchical data, and the path component serves to identify a resource. So each time you change a query component, you get a different resource, even if as implementers, we may want to think about all these similar resources or the resources identified by similar URIs as the same thing, because we are all implementing them in one piece of code. But from a traditional URI point of view, this is a different resource. And if you read RFC 9.11.0, standard 97, the HTTP semantics, that takes the same position. So I think we can say this is pretty well entrenched in the other standards that are relevant to the web. Now there is one more document that's worth looking at, the BCP 190, which used to be known as Get Off My Lawn, which essentially says it's entirely the job of the server to decide how URIs look like. So the server offers a number of resources, and the name he gives to those resources, the URI he provides, or it provides in English, is dependent entirely on the decisions of the server. And fending off something that apparently more people tend to invent, prefixing query parameters with my_app_ or something like that, or in our case with C dot, does not help, because the prefix itself is subject to the risk of collision. So if I define a new query parameter, which is C.Borman, then that collides with the other query parameters that are conditional attributes. So BCP 190 is kind of telling us we should not try to make something special based on a prefix. But again, let's not draw too early conclusions here. HTML has an interesting property, the HTML form, which you all know about, which we are also trying to adapt to the IoT space using Coral forms. And these essentially tell the client how to construct a request URI. I have no idea where the word URI on this slide has been going to, but it tells the client, put this and that and that and that in the URI, and specifically, if you construct a GET request, then this lands in the in the UI. For post request, it might be in the request content. So the server specifies or tells the client how to construct the URI. So the server does not give up sovereignty over the namespace. It just tells the client how to navigate the namespace. And we usually call this jokingly URI arithmetic, because the client starts to compute and create URIs. And that, of course, can be also be performed in JavaScript, that the server sent to the client to compute the next UI to use. This is, again, under server control. So as long as everything is under server control, we are right there in the traditional way to use the web. While the whole thing happens in HTML, it has been pretty much a part of how people have been using the web for 30 years now. So there is this other thing called APIs. APIs are not something that a client can usually understand. These documents are human readable. They are also machine readable, but not enough machine readable that the machine can act on them, except maybe generate some code. So APIs describe things like how to construct a UI, but in a way that is not really under control of the server anymore. And that has certain advantages and certain disadvantages, but it definitely means you have to implement something to work with an API, and there's a human there that reads the API and implements something. So one question that comes up to my mind is the conditional attributes or conditional query parameters. Is that part of an API that we define here? BCP 190 seems to be not so happy about this API approach. So instead of having a specification somewhere that says if it starts with C dot, then you can ignore it, it should be something that comes out of a dynamic application of the protocol in the form of links. So this is the BCP. It means we have IETF consensus to do things this way. But of course, the BCP doesn't really tell us that this also applies to the Internet of Things. So we could make a case that our world is different and we therefore are not following this BCP, but I think we would have a hard time arguing that. Now let's look at one more thing, the HTTP query method. That has been in the making since 2015, and in 2017 we lost patience and just did our own thing here, which was called fetch. The original proposal was called search. Now it's called query. Query is syntactically like a post, so it can have a request body. And on the other hand, it semantically is like a get, so it's safe, it's idempotent, and it's cacheable. So you get the best of both worlds. And today, people who want to do something that they will be using HTTP query in the future for will just use post and lose the benefit of these three properties that query can now sport. So this is being worked on, and it's getting better and better. There's a -09 which came out a couple of days ago, so HTTP will have something like fetch, and I think we can use the thinking there. And it turns out they came up with something which is quite similar to what we did 8 years ago. So query also does not deviate from the principles that we have in the URI standard, in the get off my lawn BCP, and in the HTTP standard. So the control of the URI space is always in the hands of the server. So putting queries into the request URI casts every possible combination of query inputs as a distinct resource. So this is an argument they are saying why query is better than doing a get with long URI. And they reinforce this by saying the query part takes part in identifying the resource. So they have a concept of actual query which is not materializing in any way. So there's a little bit about query caching. With a query method, the response could contain a location field that then can be used to access that specific query without sending the body again. We haven't formalized that in Coel, but of course we could do the same. So essentially, this is a pretty well-established web principle. The server has control. And one question we could ask ourselves is, does this apply to the thing web as well, or is it big web only? Or maybe it does apply, but maybe there are some tweaks. So I think we need to think about that. But I think in general, we want to keep the big web and the thing web as close as possible, in particular, so we can write cross proxies that don't have to do miracles. So we would have a good reason, would need a good reason to change this. Okay, and once we have had this discussion, we may want to think about what this means for the corrections and clarifications document. So we have a lot of web principles that we implicitly inherited because we designed the constraint RESTful environment as something that is the thing web, even if other people later claimed that term. So we shouldn't be in a situation that we need to explicitly adopt every single web principle that comes across, but we should feel at home at those principles. So if there's something that we find here that needs to make an explicit statement, then we should probably put something into CorcLA, and maybe we will even have a new category, implicit adoptions or something like that. There's also another document, the RESTful IoT document, that also could contain information about this, but this is informational, so it wouldn't have any normative effect. And of course, we could do things in specific drafts, for instance, in the conditional attribute draft. So really the point here is this, the server can do that. So the server can do whatever it wants to do. What BCP 190 tries to guard against is that we fence the server in with all kinds of mechanisms and specifications that restrict that freedom. But the server might still be in a situation where it says, I want to follow this convention, and here's my target attribute that I actually use to declare that, so the client knows that this convention will be followed as well. So that might be the way out. But of course, there's still a little bit of infringement on the freedom of the server to control the space, because we have a specification, even if the server needs to explicitly decide it wants to follow it. So that's my 2 cents about this. And I'm interested in the discussion and whether I have to write a paragraph or 2 for the corrections and clarifications document. Let's go.
Yeah, I did have maybe some questions. So the aspect of server control, I was thinking that if the server basically announces, okay, I have this resource and it follows a particular interface, maybe with the IF equals something tag, then basically it could constrain that resource to follow the interface, right? And the interface could decide, yes, for example, that, okay, all C dot query parameters have a special meaning in this interface, and if you don't like it, you don't use this interface. Something like that. Is that a compatible view?
Yeah, except for the last sentence you said, if you use the server, you will use whatever the server said. So you will get this interface then, but you have no control over that. But the point of having the target attribute is that the client gets to know whether the server declares to have a certain behavior. So the client might be encouraged by finding this IF target attribute to send in a new query parameter that hasn't been used so much like the other ones.
Yeah, but the server could still decide to implement the conditional query parameters that are described in the document, and it could also decide I'm also going to implement the C dot Bormann query parameter for something completely different. So it could do that, right? And there might be an overlap in the future, but yeah, that's also up to the server to do that or not do that.
Yeah, but by saying IF equals whatever we come up with, the server says, I'm not going to do something completely different for the query parameter C dot Bormann, but all the C dot query parameters I offer fit into the conditional attributes scheme.
Yeah, well, that's kind of sort of an API promise. Then okay,
Yeah.
we expect the server to keep to that. And yeah, I just wondered if that is kind of sufficient for these BCPs, because you can actually discover the way of interacting with that resource, and the server is still free to use it or not use it, this convention. So that seems to be okay. But it's
Yeah,
not.
it would be a problem if we define 35 of these and place the server into a labyrinth, finding out what it still can do after having announced all these 35 IF parameters. But I think that's not what we're actually doing.
Yeah, well, that's kind of another point. So if you get more of these interfaces, then if at some point you support 30 for a single resource, that kind of gets to a scalability issue. I think the client might not know all of these. So, but yeah, in terms of IoT, I notice also that clients are not that smart in general. So they're not kind of analyzing all the interfaces or resource types and then doing something smart with the combination. It's just typically look for a specific interface or specific resource type, and once they find it, they use pre-programmed type of request to that. Yeah.
Okay, I hope I have not further confused the issue, but I think that there's a pretty strong statement in BCP 190, and by having the server declare this target attribute, it can still give the client assurance that new conditional query parameters that the server doesn't know will be ignored.
Yeah, because I think in the current document for the conditional query parameters, there is no discovery defined. So, I mean, the client cannot discover if a resource supports these attributes or not. So that's another usage model where, yeah, you assume that by design, the client knows what the server supports on that resource. But yeah, that seems less compatible with the BCPs.
Okay, so I think we can now open the discussion, this big discussion.
Right, I think one of the proposals was for the conditional query parameters to actually define such an interface name, so that basically it becomes discoverable for a resource whether it supports that or not. I don't think that's a guarantee that all servers will actually use that, but at least it seems that you need something like that to enable the more flexible usage and enabling the extension with new query parameters.
Yeah, the interface attribute may be implied by the resource type attribute. That's another little complication.
Yes.
But in principle, having this interface attribute will avoid this problem the client is in otherwise, whether the client is free to send query parameters the server might not understand.
Yes, and the other question was, I think, what to do in this case with unrecognized query parameters. And then the most, kind of future-proof solution would be actually to just ignore them in this case. So that means that the client will get more, basically more notifications than it asked for, but the observe still works in that case. So that, to me, that sounds also fine to have that.
Yeah, the usual question. Oh, Marco's in the queue. Sorry, Marco, go ahead.
Yeah, I was really on the same topic, considering the recent rereading of that discussion on the list. Yes, on the interface to declare what the server supports, and related on the supported or not supported parameter. I think Christian's input was building on that interface value defined. Yeah, considering NOPs, conditional query parameters that are not recognized. But if I understood correctly, that input, it wasn't really saying anything about not supported query parameters in general beyond those. That's more of a general problem to be addressed somewhere else.
Yeah, that would be, I think, currently kind of server specific, right? Because the server is under control of what are the resources, and it can decide to ignore certain query parameters, kind of basically virtually serving the same resource for any parameters that it doesn't recognize. But it can
that's
also
not the
error, I think.
That's not the point. The server can do that. The point of this IF attribute would be to say, hey, client, you can try new query parameters with a CDOT prefix without being punished for it.
Yeah, that's right.
Typically, when we do something like this, the ignore unknown feature in a protocol design, we always ask the question, do we possibly need must understand variance? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. But I think that's a decision we need to make awake.
Okay, this is like the co-op options, you mean? Like they can be mandatory to understand or optional to understand?
Yeah, they are called elective and critical because you wanted to have a short word for that.
Yeah,
that's exactly the same thing. And my hunch would be we don't need that, but let's talk about it. And I don't know if Marco is still in the queue.
No, sorry, I was just typing. Couldn't unmute myself.
So maybe Dave has an opinion.
Yes, hi, Dave Robin. I was just I'm noting that we're 37 minutes into this discussion before the word "must understand" occurred, and which really surprised me because that's typically something that we always talk about when we get into this situation. Now the query parameter at hand, and I agree entirely, Karsten, that there's when you debate it, sometimes you decide you have to have must understand, sometimes you decide you don't. So it's very awkward, and that's why I haven't chimed in until now. But the query parameter that says something like rate limit or just don't send me if it doesn't change by this much, but it still quote succeeds. If it's ignored, that's different than a query parameter that is specifically limiting a query somehow. And so, for example, in the building automation protocol that we designed, if you don't understand a filter query parameter that is somehow putting constraints on the answer, you might get back a 500 internal error out of resources response because it ignored your filter and it tried to answer your query, and it's huge. The filter becomes critical. Whereas if the client got back a unknown query parameter, it would then turn around and ask for them a different way. Perhaps, one individually drill down deeper to get an individual resource rather than sitting 3 levels up and then filtering. So if you just simply ignore, in all cases, as a great, we agree, you always ignore, that's always the right answer. Sometimes that causes the weird error messages to come back. And the client doesn't know what's wrong. The client doesn't know that it was ignored and then ran out of memory. It just, maybe it's asking a little too much of the client to figure out what to do with that error message. Whereas if he got unknown option, then he could have a switch statement that says, okay, I'll try it a different way. So, or unsupported, you know, I mean, that's where the client could say, well, in this case, I'm going to send this thing with a must understand bit, because I know you probably can't handle the answer if you don't understand this. But in another case, he might send the same query with a must understand false. So it says, I don't care. So it's really up to the client, perhaps, as to whether he cares or not. And so when you get into this discussion about must understand, it's sometimes useful to make that a parameter on the parameter. In other words, you don't just have these options are must understand and these options are not. It's really up to the client as to whether it says, you need to understand this or you can ignore it. There are situations where he would send it different ways. So that's my 2 cents for now.
Right. In this case, you could even think that co-op options could be used for that, because we have the basically the elective options and the other ones. I forgot the name. But yeah, well, what the draft was doing is here basically reusing the URI query options for that. So there's only one flavor of that in principle.
Yeah, I have a fun proposal. Let's use C dot, and if the C is uppercase, it's a must understand. If it's lowercase, it's you might ignore.
Right. No, that's the extra bit. Exactly.
Exactly. And I can show you the bit in the ASCII coding where that you flip it on and off.
Yeah, why not use co-op options for that? So you could just define 2 new co-op options to do this. So there must be some reason that it was not chosen to use a co-op option in this document.
Yeah, because you can funnel them to existing libraries most of which will already support queries and so on.
Yeah, well, that's a typical case where you can say a protocol has some nice features for extensibility that you could use, but everyone wants to use existing libraries, so they innovate one layer higher up basically to work around and do the same. So we get that again. Yeah. Okay, one thing to consider here about suppose that the client says, oh, I'm leaving out any of these conditional query parameters, so I'm just calling an observe on the resource. And I won't expect in this case that we would get a server overload or some 5.00 error, because the resource is in fact observable, so even without query parameters, so it should just work, even if the server does not recognize any of those query parameters. So that's what we have here in a specific case, which is different than a general application filter case where the answer might be, well, too large to basically send by the server. I don't think we have that case here with observe, because the resource is in fact observable in a normal way. So that's what my guess, at least.
Yeah, but that also means that the server probably should be choosing reasonable defaults, so it doesn't have to run into a 503 for every unparameterized request.
Yeah, some defaults. I think there are some query parameters that will actually increase the number of notifications, right? I'm not sure about that. I didn't check actually, because there's, for example, something like a maximum period, I think, is one of the parameters. Let's see what that is. Oh yeah, that defines the maximum time between notifications here. So you could set it to 10 milliseconds according to the draft, and then you get a lot of notifications. Okay, so this could pose some overload conditions in principle.
Yeah, I think we are not going to get in a situation where you cannot do things that don't make sense. I think this is too
Right.
complicated to ensure
Yeah.
that, but
You can't
it
avoid,
shouldn't always happen by accident.
yeah, but the default notification should be at least kind of well chosen by the server implementer,
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
that is at least allowed. So you can observe also without any parameters. And then you can use the parameters to get, for example, more notifications or less notifications in a specific way.
Good. I hope we have good notes. And I can think about, Marco, right?
Yeah, just to, well, wrap up in principle. For the conditional attributes draft, I think we have a safe way forward, considering the interface for discovery and the no-ops semantics for query conditional or conditional query parameters that are not understood. That feels safe. Thinking more in general for other query parameters that can be used by a server that runs the draft or by any other server, that points back to the topic you discussed more in general, Karsten, and possibly for Clara. So if we want to remain close to the big web, that I see personally as a good thing, also thinking of cross proxies, like you said, does that mean just failing with 404 simply? For a non-recognized query parameter, I mean, there's no resource here.
Yeah, what does recognize mean? So if a server decides, I understand every query parameter that starts with lowercase c dot, and my implementation of them is to ignore them, that's totally cool for a server to do.
Mm.
The question is whether we plaster the world with specifications that require servers to do that. And I think we have found a reasonable middle ground in the discussion so far. And I was hoping to maybe capture this in a section of corrections and clarifications, even if it's not really either of them.
So
Yeah,
it becomes really a convention in the value of the query parameter.
Yeah, without this convention, the server's action would make sense. So
right.
That's why you want to have that convention.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, maybe just one follow-up question on that. So you mentioned the 404, which means, okay, the resource is not there, and I can understand that given the descriptions of the query parameter that it's used to identify a resource as well. It could still be a kind of counterintuitive for people that have the mindset like, okay, the resource is identified by the URI path, basically, and the query is some sort of extra parameter that you basically give to that resource to do something. So it's the same resource regardless of the query parameters. Maybe that's the wrong mental model, but
Yep.
I think quite some people still have that in mind, and then they would not think about replying 404. Also, stack implementations, yeah, might typically not do that, I think, because hey, the resource is registered by the application code, so it's there. So they won't give 404, but they will leave the choice of the error to give to the handler of the resource, which could choose anything like 400, for example. But yeah, that's just additional thought on that. And both type of codes are okay in this case, I think. So either no error or 404 or 400.
Yeah, so
Even
if
500 could be used. Yeah.
Well, it should be used if the server breaks for some reason.
Yeah, or maybe it
usually
breaks.
use.
Well, maybe it does break because of that.
Usually you use the 4-dot error codes to tell the client there's no point in trying this because it won't work the next time either.
Yeah, so that could be 400 then also. Okay.
Good.
Right, and maybe one question. So about the draft conditional query parameters. So in what stage was that? Was it kind of just past the working group last call, or
the authors are processing the Shepherd review from Jaime, and following Jaime's review, more reviews and comments came in, including these ones.
Right.
We are in that stage.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of still under control of the working group to make changes, basically, if we want. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So at some point we need to decide whether to do another working group last call.
Right. Yeah.
A question also, well, both Carsten and Esko, considering also the possible developments that were discussed, do you see any reason to enable the server to tell the client what parameters were not understood exactly as part of an error response, for example, with problem details?
Yeah, I think that's useful, if only for diagnostic purposes. So I think problem details is the right way to do this.
Yeah, so it's an optional problem details that can be included. So is that a specific format, a CBOR format, or?
Yes.
Okay.
And that should probably be a standard entry, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that, absolutely. And typically, I would vote. Sorry, I don't know the COAP codes as well as HTTP. I would return a 400 bad request because it says, malformed request syntax, something like that, is the best choice, because it's not really not found unless you take the strict doctrine that every query parameter identifies a new resource. I think that may be true in the documents, but it's kind of a surprise to some developers. Not found is not found. They think only of the path part, whereas they think the query parameter is modifying. Once you get there, this is how I want you to modify the query. Whereas 404 would make them suspect the path is wrong, not suspect that the query parameters are wrong. So I would just vote for 400 because it says, you've given me an invalid request. Of all the 400 series, that seems to be the obvious. But I chimed in here because I said absolutely +1 for including in the body of the response at least a human readable description of I didn't understand this query option, or at best we agree on a standard way of framing that. So a sub error code. 400 is too broad. If you could actually include, which I'm used to doing in our protocol, we include a response, committee decision. We actually return errors as 200 okay with a body of question mark space, which is never a valid value, followed by an actual error code. And the actual error code is actionable. It's you get a 56 back, you can put it in a switch statement and do something with it. So having an actual code in the response in some way or another and a human readable description, I think is your cake and eat it too. And of course, we also argue in general, the philosophy is if I don't be too fine-grained in your error codes, because if I can't put it in a switch statement and actually do something with it, then I don't need 400 error codes. If there's only 3 things that I can do, the rest of it is the human readable stuff for the log. So anyway, that's a different religious debate I won't get into. But yes, absolutely, I would love to have the reason for rejection in the body of the rejection.
So we have RFC 9290, which defines concise problem details. So this is an idea we stole from the HTTP people, who have a different number that I forget, 9457. But we did it in a way that it can be very compact if you want to.
Okay, just a question there. So is it also defined there how that goes into a co-op error response, basically?
Yes.
Okay, and that's okay, somewhere in there. Yeah, I'll have a look.
But it's only for error responses, right? It's just a payload with a particular structure.
Yeah, because normally I think it was defined as a text payload, right, for error responses.
It's CBOR because it's more compact.
Yeah.
Or what do you mean by normally? If you don't have
Well,
9290, then
RFP
you can.
7252, I think
Yeah.
defined it as text only. So yeah. So should the client have some way to determine that it's not text? Is there maybe like a content format option included in the response?
Yeah, I'm looking for it. 257.
Okay. Yeah.
So
that's
just
one.
have a look at 9290. So this is our advertisement content today. It's really a good way to handle this, and we haven't invented it. It was stolen from the HTTP.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking, I think that 7252 defines something like, okay, in an error response, you don't have a content format option, but maybe that's wrong interpretation I have.
No, the 7252 says you can send some text in the response which would otherwise not be used for an error message. And 9290 provides a way to provide a structured response so you can put it into a switch statement and react on it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that having that other types of responses for errors are okay in a way, so or defined somewhere. Yeah.
So we should collaborate on registering a standard problem detail key, section 6.1 of 9290. Which we can use for indicating that there was a query parameter that people didn't like.
Okay. Yeah, that can be added to then the registration for that. All right.
Then I guess the body of that error information would be simply the list of the query parameters that were problematic, or the first one that caused the failing at least.
Yep.
That's debatable.
Yeah, maybe one or more indeed.
Yeah.
I don't know what's best. Okay.
At least they are text strings. That should be simple. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
I hate to throw in one other thing, but while you're creating error codes, we very much enjoy the parameter out of range error code that says, yes, I understood your query parameter, but 1,000, really? So that's very helpful, because if you just say understood is different than understanding the value you're giving me. So parameter out of range is very helpful.
Yeah, and you could have an observable resource that gives you text or other data, and then put a parameter on it for greater than 500 or something, and that's also won't work. That will give some error probably. So that's another case.
And that feels more like a 400 in this case.
Yep.
Yeah, the error codes and the problem details are kind of orthogonal, so you might use the same problem details with different error code. Okay, but let's not discuss it. Let's not design it right now, because there are certainly a few things that we want to put there.
Okay, any more comments or questions on this topic? Looks like not in the chat at least. Okay, then we can get to the second item. I think you don't have slides, Karsten. You just wanted
That's
to
correct.
make an overview. Okay.
Yeah, so let me just quickly remind people what this was about. We have the CoreConf work item that we are working on, And one result of that is the Yang-Sieber representation format, and also a way to get rid of all those text-based names for positions in the schema tree that you normally use in a Yang response. So we are replacing these text-based identifiers by numeric identifiers, by an integer, and we have a pretty elaborate registration system in RFC 9595 that allows you to maintain, manage, administer those numbers. Now, this is all great. None of this needs repair. But then people came in, this is still too much work for you. Even if I only have to send one or two things to IANA, I don't really want to do that. And in the management space, many people, including myself, have a private enterprise number, which is a number that right now is below 60,000 or so. I don't remember the details. It's, of course, growing all the time. And this, of course, is a nice way to construct numbers that could be used by an entity for creating SIDs for their own Yang specifications. So this is essentially a zero threshold. If you have been doing anything with management in your life, you have a private enterprise number, so you don't have to do anything to generate a valid SID. Now, these SIDs may be of a slightly lower quality because they are not running through a registration process. But in some cases, that's just what you want. You want to be able to throw these out and use them and don't have to talk to anyone about this. So a long time ago, I just wrote a draft saying you can get 64-bit SIDs based on your private enterprise number, and I think 100,000 for everyone. So this will be almost as large as the allocation the entire IETF has. So you should get by with that. And recently people said, I want 32-bit SIDs to save some space. So I added to the draft another space, which of course is smaller. I think it's 10,000 SIDs, 10,000 32-bit SIDs that you also get based on your private enterprise number. So of course I could now try to register those mega ranges with IANA, but then they would tell me, can you, or the designated expert would tell me, can you actually show that you will be around in 5 years to manage this space? And of course, I don't know that. So instead I wrote up a document that will be in the RFC editor repository, and so people in 5 years will still know that these SIDs exist. So that's the point of this document. And since we started the whole thing in the core working group, it seemed appropriate for me to ask in the core working group, do we want to adopt this?
Thanks, Carsten. And yeah, as a recap of that, some more discussion happened on the list with positive feedback. Someone was trying to reduce those sizes, but then those comments were even withdrawn, as far as I could see. So I think we have definitely enough critical mass of interest and consensus to start the adoption call. And at this point, at least, I'd be more interested in hearing objections, if any. Otherwise, we can confirm this. But of course, it will continue on the list. Any comment on that or opinion already today? Esko?
Yeah, just wondering which working group should this ideally belong to, because it's about yeah, basically about yang and sits, I think, right? So we just
Yeah,
considering.
the document that defines these is 9595, and that was a working group item of this working group. So I think that's pretty obvious that we want to do this here. But yeah, we can spend a lot of time discussing that, but it's a really short draft.
Okay, yeah, just wondering if it's then, so it is within scope then. Yeah, because it's a core conf was basically defined in core, right? That was the
Yeah.
basic thing about that. So, and that's when the sits got introduced. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, sounds good to me.
Thank you.
And what was the size for each company that has a private enterprise number? What did we end up with? Was it 1 million?
No, 1 million would be too much. If you want
Oh.
1 million, you get a mega range, which is
Mega
not
range,
much
okay.
harder to do. I think it was 100,000 64 bits and 10,000 32 bits, but you can look it up.
Okay.
It's probably correct as written in the notes now also, please double check. But I think the additional 10,032 bits were not for everyone, but only for those with the lowest range of pens. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it goes unto 100,000, and then we can go back and see when we're there whether we want to extend this space. So there's still plenty of space, but maybe we don't want to do 100,000, excuse me, 10,000. So yeah, I think this all is pretty malleable, but we have to start with something. And I don't know what the current growth numbers is, but we have half a decade or so until we get to 100,000 pens.
Okay. Any more comments? Okay, then we'll have an adoption call on the list. And this brings us to the AUB. Any other business you want to discuss today? Okay, hearing none, we take back 23 minutes. Have a good rest of the day. Talk to you in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
a
you.
lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.